May 3, 1945. Camp Riverside, Oregon. The ceramic plate trembled in Lieutenant Katerina Adler's gaunt hands as she gazed at the impossible creation before her, a towering slice of dark chocolate cake, glistening with frosting so rich it seemed to absorb the spring sunlight streaming through the mess hall windows. After 4 years of surviving on acorn coffee and potato peel soup in war-torn Munich, this couldn't be real food. It had to be some elaborate American psychological trap designed to break what remained of their shattered spirits. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. Around her, 63 other German women sat frozen in identical disbelief. These weren't ordinary prisoners of war. They were the elite remnants of the Luftwaffe's Women's Auxiliary Communications Division, cipher specialists, radar operators, and intelligence analysts who had been captured during the catastrophic final weeks of the Third Reich's collapse in Bavaria. Women who had decoded enemy transmissions, tracked Allied bomber formations, and maintained the communication networks that kept German defenses operational until the very end. Women who had believed with absolute certainty in German technological superiority and American industrial incompetence. What these women couldn't comprehend was that they were about to experience the most devastating psychological assault in modern warfare, not through interrogation or re-education lectures, but through the simple act of eating dessert. Every forkful of that chocolate cake would obliterate years of Nazi indoctrination. Every taste of genuine cocoa would prove that their entire understanding of the world had been constructed from lies. The transformation would begin not with military tribunals or political discussions, but with sugar, butter, and chocolate, ingredients that had vanished from German kitchens before most of these women had even enlisted in the auxiliary services. The abundance they were about to witness would prove more destructive to Nazi ideology than any battlefield defeat could achieve. Because while military losses could be rationalized as temporary setbacks or betrayals by weak allies, the evidence of their own taste buds could not be denied, could not be explained away, could not be reconciled with everything they had been taught about American society collapsing under the weight of racial mixing and democratic chaos. To truly understand the magnitude of this moment, one must first comprehend the absolute depths of deprivation these women had endured during their service to the Reich. Oberleutnant Frieda Zimmermann, a former radar tracking specialist from Dresden, had maintained a forbidden diary throughout her 3 years of military service. Her entries, written in cramped handwriting on scraps of requisition paper, revealed the grinding reality of German food supplies by the war's final year. Her last entry before capture, dated April 18, 1945, contained words that would have seemed impossible to write just 5 years earlier. No bread distribution for 6 days. The heating oil ran out 3 weeks ago. We are eating soup made from grass clippings and whatever leather we can boil soft enough to swallow. The younger girls in our signals unit are collapsing at their posts from malnutrition. Gertrude died this morning. The official report will say pneumonia, but we all know it was starvation. She weighed perhaps 80 pounds at the end. We told ourselves this sacrifice was necessary for final victory. Now I wonder if there will be anyone left alive to see whatever victory might look like. The German Women's Auxiliary Services, the Nachrichtenhelferin units, had been promised equal rations to male soldiers. In practice, they received whatever remained after the Wehrmacht, the SS, and the Hitler Youth had taken their shares. By the winter of 1944, their daily allocation had been reduced to a mockery of nutrition, 180 grams of bread mixed with sawdust and ground peas to extend the dwindling wheat supplies, 12 grams of margarine that had usually gone rancid during transport, and ersatz coffee brewed from roasted barley that provided no nutritional value whatsoever. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. When even those meager supplies ran low, which happened with increasing frequency as Allied bombing destroyed transportation networks, the women survived on whatever they could scavenge. Underlieutenant Rosa Becker, captured while maintaining cipher equipment in a command bunker outside Nuremberg, later described the final months with brutal honesty. We hadn't seen real chocolate since 1940. Genuine milk was reserved for wounded officers in field hospitals. The children in Munich were developing rickets because there was no calcium in their diet. We told ourselves the Americans were suffering far worse, that their cities were experiencing famine while ours endured with dignity and purpose. Every empty belly was proof of our moral superiority over the decadent West. Every hunger pain was evidence that we were stronger, more disciplined, more worthy of eventual victory than our enemies could ever be. The journey to American captivity had begun during the chaotic final collapse of German military organization in late April 1945. Unlike male combat soldiers captured in pitched battles, these women had been taken when Allied forces overran their communication installations and command posts. Many had never seen direct combat, but they had witnessed something perhaps more psychologically devastating, the complete disintegration of the system they had served with unquestioning loyalty. The initial shock had come immediately upon processing at the temporary holding facility in liberated France. American medical officers, including female doctors and nurses whose very existence contradicted Nazi teachings about women's proper roles, had examined each prisoner with a thoroughness that revealed the true extent of German deprivation. Major Catherine Reynolds, chief medical officer at the processing station, documented conditions in her official reports that read like descriptions of concentration camp victims rather than military personnel. These women averaged 35 pounds below normal weight for their heights. Scurvy is present in every single case. Approximately 60% show advanced signs of beriberi from vitamin B deficiency. Several have developed night blindness from vitamin A starvation. Their hair is brittle and breaking. Their teeth are loose and their gums from malnutrition. Multiple cases of stress fractures from calcium deficiency. We are treating enemy military personnel who are in worse physical condition than our own soldiers after months of combat operations with limited field rations. The contrast with American abundance began immediately, even before the women fully understood what they were experiencing. While being processed, each German prisoner received what American soldiers called a C-ration, standard field provisions that American troops routinely complained about as boring and unappetizing. To women who hadn't seen real meat in 18 months, these field rations seemed like impossible luxury. Underlieutenant Becker wrote in a letter that somehow survived German censorship attempts. The Americans gave us small tin containers holding more food than I had seen in half a year. Crackers that weren't moldy. Meat that was genuinely meat, not the mysterious pressed substance labeled as protein we had known in Germany. And chocolate, small brown squares that I had completely forgotten existed. The guards apologized that this was only emergency field rations, nothing like real food. They apologized for giving us more than we had eaten in months. The transport to permanent internment camps provided the next wave of revelations that would begin eroding the foundations of Nazi ideology. These women traveled not in cargo trucks or cattle cars, but in actual passenger coaches with cushioned seats and windows that opened to admit fresh air. During the multi-day journey from the Atlantic Coast processing centers to Camp Riverside in Oregon, they witnessed an America that Nazi propaganda had declared could not possibly exist. Every small town they passed blazed with electric lights even during evening hours. Every farm they saw had tractors and trucks rather than horse-drawn equipment. Every train station where their coach stopped for refueling revealed American civilians eating food that would have been considered fit for German aristocracy before the war. Women in clean dresses buying fresh bread from station vendors. Children drinking milk from glass bottles. Men smoking cigarettes and reading newspapers printed on quality paper that hadn't existed in Germany since 1942. Oberleutnant Zimmermann pressed her face against the train window, watching the American landscape roll past with growing confusion. Everything we were told about America was wrong. They said American cities were starving under rationing worse than ours. But every town we pass has shops with full windows. They said American agriculture was failing because the men had gone to war. But every farm we see has more machinery than German agricultural collectives ever possessed. They said American morale was collapsing. But everyone we see looks well-fed, well-dressed, and entirely unconcerned that their country is fighting a war on two continents simultaneously. Camp Riverside, Oregon, had been rapidly converted from a training facility to house the unexpected influx of German female military prisoners. The camp's commanding officer, Colonel Patricia Hartwell, understood that these women represented something unprecedented in military history. Unlike male combat prisoners who might maintain their loyalty through shared battlefield experiences, these women had served the Nazi system in technical and support roles. Their psychological transformation could demonstrate that even the most ideologically committed supporters could be converted through evidence rather than coercion. The camp itself exceeded anything these women had known even as civilians in peacetime Germany. Electric lights illuminated every building throughout the night. Hot water flowed from taps without restriction, not lukewarm water requiring careful rationing, but genuinely hot water that steamed and could actually clean skin and hair properly. Flush toilets and shower facilities featured soap that smelled of lavender rather than the harsh lye they had known. The barracks were heated in winter and cooled in summer through systems that maintained comfortable temperatures regardless of outside weather. Each woman had her own bed, not a shared bunk or a straw mattress on the floor, but an individual metal frame bed with a real mattress, clean sheets changed weekly, and wool blankets that weren't threadbare. Medical care was provided by female American military doctors who treated conditions with medicines that hadn't existed in German hospitals since before the war. Infections were controlled with penicillin. Nutritional deficiencies were addressed with vitamin supplements. Dental problems were corrected with proper equipment and anesthetics. But nothing, absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for their first meal in the camp dining hall. As they filed through the serving line on their first evening, American kitchen staff, including African American women whom Nazi ideology had declared subhuman and incapable of civilized behavior, served portions that defied every assumption about wartime scarcity. Fresh vegetables that weren't rotting or pickled. White bread so soft it compressed under gentle pressure. Butter that was actually yellow, not the gray margarine they had known. And meat, recognizable, genuine meat, not the mysterious canned substances labeled as protein that had comprised their rations in Germany. The psychological impact was immediate and devastating. These women had been taught that American society was collapsing under racial integration and democratic inefficiency. Yet here were African American women working seamlessly alongside white Americans, operating modern kitchen equipment, preparing food of a quality that German restaurants couldn't achieve even before the war. The racial hierarchy that formed the very foundation of Nazi ideology crumbled with every interaction, every efficiently served meal, every moment of professional competence demonstrated by women whose existence the Reich had declared biologically impossible. Oberleutnant Zimmermann documented her first American meal with the precision of a trained military observer. Beef stew containing actual recognizable chunks of meat, not gristle or organ meat, but genuine beef. Mashed potatoes with real butter, not margarine. Green beans that were fresh, not from tins or pickle jars. White bread made from actual wheat flour. And coffee, genuine coffee with cream and sugar available without limit. I ate until I became physically ill. My stomach, accustomed to turnip water and grass soup, couldn't process such richness. Other women around me were weeping while eating, unable to comprehend such abundance being given to enemies. The systematic feeding program revealed American organizational capacity that challenged every assumption about democratic inefficiency that had been drilled into these women since childhood. The camp quartermaster coordinated daily deliveries of fresh produce from local farms, meat from regional processing facilities, dairy products from multiple suppliers, and dry goods from warehouses that seemed to have unlimited inventory. The logistics required to feed 600 German women 3 substantial meals daily while maintaining variety and nutritional balance exceeded anything the German military had achieved even during peacetime. More psychologically devastating than the abundance itself was the casual waste. Kitchen staff discarded food that would have been treasured in Germany. Perfect vegetables were thrown away for minor cosmetic blemishes, bread that was a day old was fed to birds, meat trimmings that could have made soup were simply disposed of. The casual destruction of edible food demonstrated resources so vast that waste meant nothing, that abundance was so complete that perfection could be demanded and anything less than perfection could be rejected. Underlieutenant Becker watched kitchen workers scraping half-eaten portions into waste bins and felt something break inside her understanding of the world. They throw away more food in one meal service than my family saw in a month. They waste casually what we would have treasured desperately. Either everything we were told about American resource scarcity was a lie, or I am losing my mind and hallucinating this abundance. But the food is real. The taste is real. The fullness in my stomach is real. Which means the lies were real too. The women adapted to regular meals with a speed that astonished the camp medical staff. Within 2 weeks, the most severe malnutrition symptoms began reversing. Within a month, women who had looked skeletal were beginning to show healthy weight gain. The transformation was so dramatic that Major Reynolds documented it as unprecedented in her medical experience. These prisoners are recovering from severe malnutrition faster than any cases I've encountered in my career. The combination of adequate calories, proper nutrition, and reduced stress is producing almost miraculous changes. Women who could barely walk upon arrival are now participating in camp activities. The psychological impact of this physical recovery cannot be overstated. They are experiencing in their own bodies the proof that everything they believed about American society was false. But the moment that would define their transformation was yet to come. The moment when American abundance would be served not as mere sustenance, but as pleasure. As luxury. As proof that a society could create such surplus that enemies could be given treats unknown to their own families back home. The afternoon of May 3 brought an announcement that sent ripples of confusion through the women's barracks. Today would be different, the camp administrator explained in careful German. Today they would experience what Americans called a special occasion. Today they would taste something that American families enjoyed regularly, something that represented the abundance of a free society. The camp's head baker, Staff Sergeant Dorothy Martinez from San Antonio, Texas, had spent the morning preparing something these German women had never encountered even in their most prosperous pre-war memories. Her kitchen, equipped with industrial ovens, commercial mixers, and refrigeration units that maintained perfect temperatures, had produced a creation that would challenge everything these prisoners thought they knew about food, civilization, and human possibility. As the prisoners filed into the mess hall for the afternoon meal, they first noticed the aroma. Rich, deep, intoxicating, a scent that seemed to bypass rational thought and speak directly to some primal part of the brain that recognized pleasure before language could name it. The smell of chocolate baking, of sugar caramelizing, of butter integrating with cocoa into perfect harmony. Underlieutenant Becker stopped walking entirely, overcome by sensations her brain couldn't process after years of deprivation. The smell alone was more intense than any food experience she had known since childhood. It carried memories of birthday parties that no longer happened, of Christmas celebrations that had been canceled, of a world before war where such luxury had been possible if rare. The serving line that day moved with unusual slowness. Each woman received her standard meal, portions that still amazed them after weeks of American feeding. But then came something that defied categorization within their experience. American kitchen staff, smiling with what appeared to be genuine warmth rather than the cruel mockery they had been taught to expect from enemies, placed a generous slice of something dark and magnificent on each tray. Chocolate cake. Towering layers of deep brown cake studded with what appeared to be chunks of pure chocolate, separated by frosting so rich it seemed almost black in the afternoon light. Each slice stood at least 4 inches tall, representing more sugar, butter, and chocolate than these women had consumed in the past 2 years combined. The German language had no adequate translation for what they were experiencing. This wasn't Kuchen, the dense, bread-like cakes of their childhood. This wasn't Torte, the elaborate but dry confections served at pre-war celebrations. This was something entirely foreign, entirely American, entirely impossible according to everything they had been taught about wartime scarcity and enemy deprivation. Oberleutnant Zimmermann lifted her fork with trembling fingers, examining the cake as if it might vanish like a dream upon waking. The texture was unlike anything in German baking tradition, moist without being soggy, dense yet somehow light, with a crumb structure that suggested careful technique and quality ingredients impossible to obtain in wartime Europe. The first bite delivered a shock that transcended mere taste to approach something like religious experience. The sweetness exploded across taste buds that had forgotten such sensations existed. The richness coated her mouth with flavors so intense they seemed almost violent after years of bland subsistence. The chocolate, real chocolate, not the ersatz substitutes made from carob and beet sugar, delivered a complexity of flavor that her palate couldn't fully process. Bitter and sweet simultaneously, rich yet clean, with undertones that suggested vanilla and butter and techniques that German bakers had never mastered. Her eyes widened involuntarily, then closed as her brain struggled to process the cascade of sensations. This single bite contained more sugar than she had consumed in 6 months. More butter than she had seen in a year. More genuine chocolate than she had tasted since before the war began. Around the mess hall, similar scenes played out with devastating psychological effect. Underlieutenant Becker bit into her cake and immediately began sobbing, not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization of what had been stolen from her life. What had been stolen from every German life by the ideology she had served without question. What had been sacrificed not for victory or survival, but for lies. Nachrichtenhelferin Greta Hoffmann, a young cipher specialist who had believed absolutely in German superiority until this moment, stared at her half-eaten slice as if it contained secrets of the universe. Which, in many ways, it did. Because this cake represented not just food but an entire system of agricultural abundance, industrial capacity, and social organization that had been declared impossible by Nazi ideology. The cake proved, with every molecule of sugar and cocoa, that free societies could not only survive but thrive. That democracy didn't lead to chaos but to prosperity. That racial integration didn't weaken civilization but strengthened it through the contributions of all people. That women could be both feminine and competent, both nurturing and professional, both traditionally female and militarily effective. Staff Sergeant Martinez watched the German women's reactions with professional satisfaction mixed with profound sadness. These weren't the hardened Nazi fanatics she had expected when assigned to this duty. They were women who had been systematically starved, not just of food, but of joy itself. The cake she had baked that morning represented more than dessert. It was proof of a society so prosperous that it could afford to give luxury foods to enemies. So confident in its values that it could demonstrate humanity even to those who had served the most inhuman regime in modern history. The recipe itself told a story of American abundance that would have seemed like impossible propaganda if presented as mere statistics. Each slice of that chocolate cake contained ingredients that represented more agricultural wealth than entire German provinces had access to during the war's final years. 1/2 cup of real butter per serving, something German civilians hadn't seen since 1941, when butter rations had been reduced to 125 grams per person per month, and even that allocation often went unfilled. 3 ounces of genuine chocolate, more than most German families consumed in an entire year, even during peacetime. Pure white sugar refined from American sugar beets and Caribbean sugar cane, ingredients that had become so scarce in Germany that the government had mandated substitutes made from beet molasses that tasted like dirt. Eggs from chickens fed on American grain, while German chickens had been reduced to eating scraps and producing eggs with pale, watery yolks if they laid at all. Vanilla extract imported from Madagascar through trade networks that spanned oceans even during global war, while Germany couldn't maintain supply lines to territories just across its own borders. Flour milled from Kansas, wheat grown on mechanized farms larger than German provinces, while German grain harvests had collapsed under labor shortages and Allied bombing. The ingredients list for a single batch of this cake represented more agricultural wealth than entire German towns had access to for a year. Yet American bakers produced thousands of such cakes daily across the nation. Children ate them at birthday parties that happened regularly rather than being canceled. Families baked them for Sunday dinners and church socials that occurred weekly. Schools served them in cafeterias as routine desserts rather than special occasion luxuries. The casual nature of such abundance destroyed every assumption about American society that Nazi ideology had constructed. The psychological impact deepened as the women realized this wasn't special treatment designed to impress prisoners or break their spirits through contrast. Through conversations with guards, through observation of American routines, they learned that this cake represented normal American life. What they were experiencing as miraculous abundance was simply Thursday afternoon in America. Underlieutenant Becker pushed her empty plate away and stared at the chocolate crumbs with an expression that mixed confusion, wonder, and something approaching horror. In Nazi ideology, such luxury was weakness, decadence that would inevitably lead to societal collapse. The pampered Americans who ate such desserts regularly couldn't possibly be the same people whose armies had conquered Europe, whose factories had outproduced the entire German war machine, whose agricultural system could afford to waste food while feeding both their own population and their enemies. The contradiction was unbearable. Either Nazi teachings about American decadence were completely false, or the evidence of her own senses was lying to her. The sweetness still coating her tongue argued powerfully for the failure of everything she had believed. Every molecule of chocolate and sugar she had consumed was proof that German propaganda had been not just wrong but deliberately, catastrophically, murderously deceptive. The transformation had already begun. These women had tasted abundance, and the flavor would haunt them for the rest of their lives. They had experienced generosity from enemies, kindness from those they had been taught to hate, and prosperity that made their former beliefs seem not just incorrect but tragically, absurdly, criminally false. As they filed out of the mess hall that afternoon, each woman carried within her body the physical evidence of American prosperity. The sugar-energizing cells that had forgotten such fuel existed. The fats rebuilding tissues depleted by years of malnutrition. The protein-strengthening muscles weakened by deprivation. But more importantly, they carried the psychological evidence that everything they had sacrificed for, everything they had believed in, everything they had served, had been a lie built on lies built on more lies. The chocolate cake was just the beginning. The evening would bring discussions that would accelerate their transformation. The next day would reveal even more shocking truths. But in that moment, walking back to their barracks with the taste of genuine chocolate still rich on their tongues, each woman knew that something fundamental had broken inside her understanding of the world. They had tasted the sweetness of truth, and it was impossible to return to the bitterness of lies. The taste of chocolate lingered long after the plates had been cleared. As twilight settled over Camp Riverside on that May evening, something unprecedented began spreading through the women's barracks, a psychological contagion more powerful than any formal re-education program could achieve. Women who had decoded enemy communications with cold precision, who had maintained military discipline under Allied bombardment, who had served the Nazi regime with unwavering dedication, found themselves questioning fundamental assumptions about reality itself. Oberleutnant Frieda Zimmermann lay on her cot that night, staring at the electric bulb that provided more steady illumination than her Dresden apartment had seen in 3 years of war. The overhead light didn't flicker. It didn't dim when neighbors turned on their lights. It simply glowed with consistent brightness, powered by an electrical grid so robust that even prisoner camps received unlimited electricity. The contrast with Germany's rolling blackouts and candlelit evenings was impossible to ignore. In her hidden diary, the one luxury she had managed to protect through capture and transport, she wrote words that would have earned immediate execution in Nazi Germany. May 3, 1945. Camp Riverside, Oregon. The Americans waste more sugar in a single dessert than the Reich allocated to entire city blocks. They give luxuries to enemies that German children have never tasted. They demonstrate abundance so casual it seems obscene after years of sacrifice. Either we have been systematically lied to about everything, or I am experiencing some form of collective delusion. But the chocolate coating my teeth feels real. The fullness in my stomach is real. The energy coursing through my previously starving body is real. Which means the lies were real too. All of them. The physical transformation was already accelerating beyond what camp medical staff had anticipated. After weeks of American rations supplemented by yesterday's shocking dessert, these skeletal women were gaining weight at rates that Dr. Catherine Reynolds documented as medically unprecedented. But the chocolate cake had triggered something beyond mere nutritional recovery. The breakfast service on May 4th brought another revelation that would compound yesterday's psychological shock. As prisoners filed through the serving line, they encountered something that seemed to violate the laws of wartime scarcity: fresh orange juice. Not ersatz fruit drink made from chemicals and artificial coloring, the standard German substitute that tasted like sweetened metal. Not watered-down juice from reconstituted powder. But juice squeezed from actual oranges that had been shipped from California groves to an Oregon prisoner camp for the benefit of German enemies. Underlieutenant Rosa Becker held the glass of orange juice as if it contained liquid gold, which, in terms of wartime Germany, it essentially did. Citrus fruits had vanished from German markets by 1942. Vitamin C deficiency had become so prevalent among German civilians that scurvy, a disease of medieval poverty, had returned to major cities for the first time in centuries. German children were developing the bleeding gums and loosening teeth of advanced malnutrition while their mothers served the regime that claimed to protect them. Yet here, in an American prison camp, captured enemies received fresh citrus as if it were the most natural provision in the world. The vitamin C flooded her system like a drug, providing energy and mental clarity she hadn't experienced since before the war. Colors seemed brighter. Thoughts flowed more clearly. Hope felt possible again. This wasn't just nutrition. It was the restoration of human dignity through the simple act of providing what bodies needed to function properly. The contrast with German prison conditions became impossible to ignore or rationalize away. German prisoners in German camps received starvation rations and died from malnutrition at rates that prison administrators accepted as inevitable. German prisoners in American camps received orange juice and chocolate cake and grew healthier every day. Oberleutnant Zimmermann watched the morning sunlight illuminate her glass of orange juice, turning it into a glowing amber beacon that seemed to mock everything she had believed about civilizational superiority. The juice had been refrigerated overnight. The oranges had traveled thousands of miles through supply networks maintained even during global war. The casual logistics required to deliver fresh citrus to enemy prisoners exceeded what the Wehrmacht could achieve for its own officers in forward positions. The transformation accelerated dramatically when camp administrators announced that prisoners could voluntarily work in various camp facilities, including the kitchen. This wasn't forced labor of the type German camps imposed on prisoners, work assignments that deliberately weakened and killed through exhaustion and starvation. This was voluntary training that would provide skills useful for post-war reconstruction, accompanied by small payments that prisoners could use in the camp commissary. The very concept challenged Nazi assumptions about American treatment of prisoners. Volunteering, training, payment. These words didn't exist in the German prison camp vocabulary. Prisoners were resources to be exploited until death, not individuals to be trained and compensated. Underlieutenant Becker volunteered for the baking detail, driven by desperate curiosity about the mysterious chocolate cake that had shattered her worldview. Standing beside Staff Sergeant Dorothy Martinez in the fully equipped industrial kitchen, surrounded by ingredients representing more agricultural wealth than entire German provinces possessed, she began to understand the true scale of American productive capacity. The kitchen itself was a technological marvel that exceeded German civilian standards even before the war. Industrial mixers that could handle 50-pound batches of dough. Ovens with precise temperature controls and timers. Refrigeration units that maintained perfect temperatures for dairy products. Running water, hot and cold, available without rationing or restriction. Electrical power that never flickered or failed. Sergeant Martinez proved to be a patient teacher whose very existence challenged Nazi racial ideology. A Mexican-American woman whose family had been in Texas since before it was part of the United States, she embodied the cultural blending that Nazi doctrine declared impossible and destructive. Her baking techniques combined European traditions with American innovations and Mexican flavors, creating results superior to any single cultural approach. The secret to good chocolate cake, Martinez explained in careful, simplified English that Becker's limited language skills could follow, is not just ingredients, though those matter. It's understanding that baking is chemistry. Precision. Respect for the process. She demonstrated measuring techniques that German home bakers had never learned, level measurements rather than approximate handfuls, precise temperatures rather than general ranges, timing measured in minutes rather than judged by appearance. The scientific approach to something as simple as cake making revealed an entire system of standardization and quality control that permeated American society. The recipe for the chocolate cake became a comprehensive lesson in American abundance that statistics alone could never convey. Each ingredient told a story of agricultural, industrial, and logistical capacity that made German achievements seem provincial by comparison. The flour came from Kansas wheat fields that stretched for hundreds of miles, single farms larger than German provinces, worked by machinery that German agriculture had never developed. American wheat yields per acre exceeded German production by factors that seemed impossible until you saw the mechanized harvesters, the scientific fertilization programs, the irrigation systems that conquered drought. The sugar derived from both sugar beet farms in Colorado and sugarcane plantations in Louisiana, dual sourcing that provided security against regional crop failures. The refining process produced pure white sugar of consistent quality, not the brown, gritty substance that passed for sugar in Germany. American sugar production exceeded domestic consumption even during wartime, allowing exports to allies and provisions for prisoners while civilians experienced no meaningful shortages. The chocolate came from international trade networks that span continents and oceans, maintained even during global war. American merchants imported cocoa beans from South America and Africa, processed them in factories that operated without interruption, and distributed the finished product so efficiently that even prisoner camps received regular supplies. The infrastructure required to maintain such supply chains during wartime exceeded anything the German military had achieved even during peacetime. The butter represented perhaps the most devastating evidence of agricultural superiority. American dairy production operated on scales that German farmers couldn't comprehend. Single dairy operations in Wisconsin or California maintained herds larger than entire German farming villages. Mechanized milking, scientific breeding, industrial processing, every aspect of American dairy exceeded German capabilities so dramatically that comparisons seemed almost cruel. The eggs came from chickens fed on grain that German poultry had never seen. American corn and wheat production exceeded what human and animal populations could consume, creating surplus that was fed to livestock or stored in government reserves against future need. German chickens had been reduced to eating scraps and producing eggs with pale, watery yolks if they laid at all. American chickens ate better than German civilians. The vanilla extract, imported from Madagascar through trade networks that crossed war zones and ocean blockades, represented global reach that Germany had never possessed even at the height of its territorial expansion. American merchant shipping maintained supply lines across the Pacific and Atlantic simultaneously, delivering luxury ingredients to civilian bakers while German supply lines couldn't maintain basic provisions to military units just across their own borders. As Becker measured these ingredients under Martinez's patient supervision, each cupful and teaspoonful hammered another crack into her ideological foundations. This single batch of cake, enough to serve 60 prisoners one generous slice each, contained more agricultural wealth than her entire hometown of Nuremberg had accessed in the final year of war. The baking process itself revealed systematic thinking and organizational efficiency that challenged every Nazi assumption about democratic chaos and inefficiency. Martinez explained each step with precision that would have impressed German military planners. Cream butter and sugar for exactly 5 minutes at medium speed. This incorporates air, making the cake light. Add eggs one at a time, waiting 30 seconds between each addition for proper emulsification. Sift dry ingredients 3 times to ensure even distribution and prevent lumps. Fold, don't stir, the chocolate chips to prevent them from sinking. Every instruction contained decades of accumulated knowledge, refined through experimentation and standardized for consistent results. This wasn't folk wisdom passed down imprecisely through generations. This was scientific method applied to baking, testable, repeatable, teachable. The American approach to something as simple as dessert demonstrated systematic thinking that permeated their entire society. The ovens themselves amazed Becker with their precision. Exact temperature controls allowed baking at 350 degrees Fahrenheit rather than approximate heat judged by hand testing. Timers ensured consistent cooking duration. Glass doors permitted monitoring without losing heat by opening the oven. Every aspect of the equipment reflected sophisticated engineering applied to civilian purposes, the same systematic approach that had produced weapons, vehicles, and aircraft that overwhelmed German military technology. As the cakes baked, filling the kitchen with that intoxicating chocolate aroma, Becker found herself weeping quietly. Not from sadness, but from the overwhelming realization of what German society had sacrificed in service to ideology. The warmth, the sweetness, the simple pleasure of creating something beautiful, all denied to German civilians who had been told that such luxuries were decadent, that sacrifice was virtue, that suffering proved superiority. Martinez noticed the tears but said nothing, simply placing a hand on Becker's shoulder in a gesture of human connection that crossed supposed racial and national boundaries. The silent compassion from this Mexican-American woman toward a former enemy demonstrated humanity that Nazi ideology had declared impossible between superior and inferior races. That afternoon brought another shock that would prove even more psychologically devastating than dessert. The camp library. These German women who had served an ideology that burned books and restricted information discovered they had access to thousands of volumes, including German literature that had been banned in their homeland. Oberleutnant Zimmermann discovered the library almost by accident, following signs in both English and German that directed prisoners to various camp facilities. The building itself, a converted recreation hall, contained more books than most German schools had possessed before the war. Neatly organized shelves held works in multiple languages, carefully catalogued and freely available to prisoners without restriction or supervision. The German literature section delivered the most profound shock. Complete collections of Goethe, Schiller, Heine, Thomas Mann, German cultural treasures that the Nazi regime had either banned outright or heavily censored. Zimmermann pulled a volume of Heinrich Heine's poetry from the shelf with trembling hands. Heine, banned in Germany since 1933 because of his Jewish heritage, here preserved and available in an American prison camp library. Reading her own cultural heritage without the filter of ideological interpretation proved more subversive than any American propaganda lecture could have been. These were the poets and philosophers who had made German culture great, whose works had been systematically destroyed or suppressed by the regime she had served. The realization that Americans preserved German culture better than Germans themselves had been maintaining it delivered a blow to national pride that military defeat alone could never have achieved. The shelves also contained philosophical and scientific works that contradicted Nazi doctrine, books proving that racial theories were pseudoscience, that democratic systems could function efficiently, that cultural mixing produced strength rather than weakness. Darwin's actual writings rather than the distorted interpretations the Reich had promoted. Political philosophy from Locke and Jefferson explaining democratic principles. Scientific journals demonstrating research that German universities had abandoned when Jewish professors were expelled. But perhaps most devastating were the American magazines and newspapers that revealed the true scope of the society that had defeated them. Life magazine, Look, the Saturday Evening Post, publications that showed American daily life in photographs that couldn't be dismissed as propaganda because they contained too much mundane detail to be fabricated. Zimmermann sat at a library table, turning pages of a Life magazine from March 1945, and witnessed an America that bore no resemblance to Nazi descriptions. Suburban homes with multiple automobiles parked in driveways. Kitchens equipped with refrigerators, electric stoves, washing machines, appliances that German nobility didn't possess. Children playing with toys that would have been impossible luxuries in Germany. Women wearing dresses that required fabric allocations exceeding German monthly rations. The advertisements proved even more revealing than the articles. Companies competing for consumer attention with promises of superior products, soap that cleaned better, flour that baked lighter, chocolate that tasted richer. The casual assumption of abundance, of choice, of competing brands offering similar products, demonstrated an economy operating on principles German planners had never understood. A Hershey's chocolate advertisement showed a mother serving chocolate milk to children after school, exactly the beverage that had shocked German prisoners into psychological crisis. But the ad treated it as routine, as normal, as something so common it required advertising to distinguish one brand from competitors. American children drank chocolate milk regularly enough that companies competed for their parents' purchasing decisions. A gold medal flour advertisement promised consistent results every time, the scientific standardization that German baking had never achieved. American housewives expected flour that performed identically batch after batch, while German bakers adapted recipes to whatever flour mixture they received, if they received any at all. The magazine's articles revealed scale that made German accomplishments seem trivial. A feature on Iowa corn production described single farms producing more grain than entire German agricultural regions. A story about Detroit automobile manufacturing showed factories that produced more vehicles in a month than Germany had manufactured in a year. An article about the Manhattan Project, heavily censored but revealing enough, demonstrated scientific research that German programs couldn't match despite German physicists inventing the underlying theories. The library's reference section contained government publications and statistical abstracts that provided hard numbers behind American capability. Zimmerman, trained in military communications analysis, understood how to read statistics and assess their implications. What she discovered demolished every remaining assumption about relative civilizational achievement. American steel production in 1944, 89.6 million tons. German production in the same period, 28.5 million tons. The United States alone outproduced Germany by a factor of 3, and that was before counting British, Soviet, and other Allied production. American aircraft production in 1944, 96,318 planes. German production, 39,807. Again, nearly a 3-to-1 advantage before counting other Allied producers. American merchant shipping construction, enough tonnage to replace all losses and expand the fleet. German merchant shipping, losses that couldn't be replaced, leading to collapse of supply lines. American agricultural production, surpluses that fed not only domestic population and military forces, but also allied nations and even prisoners of war. German agricultural production, deficits that required starvation rations for civilians and contributed to military defeat. But the most devastating statistics weren't about military production. They were about civilian consumption even during total war. American civilians maintained average caloric intake above 3,000 per day throughout the war. German civilians dropped below 1,500 by 1945. American sugar consumption remained at 100 pounds per capita annually. German sugar rations dropped to 15 pounds per capita, and actual distribution fell far below official allocations. American automobile ownership, approximately 1 car for every 5 people even after civilian production had been halted for military manufacturing. German automobile ownership, approximately 1 car per 50 people before the war, and civilian cars had been largely confiscated for military use by 1944. American electrical service, near universal coverage with unlimited availability. German electrical service, rolling blackouts even in major cities, with restrictions increasing throughout the war. The numbers told a story of 2 civilizations operating on completely different scales. Germany had been fighting a war of scarcity, carefully allocating limited resources and demanding sacrifice from civilians to support military operations. America had been fighting a war of abundance, producing enough to supply military forces, maintain civilian living standards, support allies, and even provide for enemies, all simultaneously. The evening meal on May 4th featured roasted chicken with vegetables, another demonstration of casual abundance that would have been considered an elaborate feast in Germany. But the food provoked less discussion than the discoveries women had made throughout the day. As they ate, conversations broke out that revealed the depth of their collective psychological crisis. Nachrichten Helfer and Greta Hoffmann, who had maintained radio communications during the retreat from France, spoke the question others were thinking: if they can afford to stock prison camp libraries with thousands of books while fighting a global war, what other lies were we told? If they feed enemies better than our government fed loyal citizens, what does that say about the system we served? Underlieutenant Becker, still processing what she had learned in the kitchen that morning, added her own observations. The kitchen equipment here exceeds what German restaurants had before the war. The ingredients we used for 1 batch of cake would have fed a German family for weeks. And Sergeant Martinez, a Mexican-American woman we were taught to consider inferior, knows more about systematic baking than any German baker I've met. How is that possible if our racial theories were correct? Oberleutnant Zimmerman, the most senior officer among the prisoners, had maintained quiet authority throughout their captivity. But tonight she spoke with uncertainty that would have been unthinkable weeks earlier. I spent the afternoon in the library reading German poets who were banned in Germany but preserved here. I saw magazines showing American families living with abundance we never achieved even during peacetime prosperity. I read statistics proving that America outproduced us in every category while maintaining higher civilian living standards than we achieved during our best years. Either every number is falsified, every photograph is staged, every book is propaganda, or everything we believed was a lie. The discussions continued long after the meal ended, spreading through the barracks as women shared discoveries and questioned assumptions. Some remained defiant, insisting that this was elaborate psychological manipulation designed to break their spirits. But their protests grew weaker as more evidence accumulated, as more women experienced similar revelations, as the simple reality of American abundance overwhelmed ideological resistance. The following days brought a cascade of experiences that accelerated the psychological transformation beyond what camp administrators had anticipated. Each new revelation built upon previous shocks, creating cumulative effect that demolished ideological certainty. The camp medical clinic demonstrated healthcare that exceeded German civilian standards even before the war. Modern equipment, abundant medicines, female doctors who treated patients with respect and competence. The penicillin that cured infections German doctors could only watch progress to death. The vitamin supplements that reversed deficiency diseases. The dental care that addressed problems German dentists lacked equipment to treat. Dr. Catherine Reynolds documented the transformation in her medical reports. Physical recovery continues to exceed expectations. But the psychological changes are more dramatic. These women are experiencing cognitive dissonance so severe it amounts to complete worldview reconstruction. Every interaction with American systems, medical, educational, nutritional, organizational, contradicts what they were taught about democratic inefficiency and racial hierarchy. The transformation isn't being imposed through coercion but emerging naturally from exposure to evidence. The camp recreational facilities provided another shock. Volleyball courts, a small library reading room, a space for music and performances. The concept that prisoners should have recreation, that human beings needed more than mere survival, that even enemies deserved dignity and stimulation, these ideas challenged authoritarian assumptions about human nature and social organization. Most shocking was the absence of punishment and brutality that German prisoners had expected based on their own experience with German prison camps. Guards carried weapons but rarely used them. Discipline was maintained through reasonable rules rather than fear. Prisoners who broke regulations received proportional consequences rather than savage beatings. The humane treatment proved more psychologically devastating than cruelty would have been because it demonstrated that the weakness Germany had mocked was actually strength, that treating humans humanely produced better results than treating them brutally. The evening of May 7 brought an announcement that represented the final blow to authoritarian thinking. The meal service that night would include options, multiple choices for each course, allowing individual preference rather than collective uniformity. The concept seemed simple, almost trivial. Yet for women who had grown up under a system where individual preference was subordinated to state-defined collective needs, the ability to choose their own meal represented a profound shift. In Nazi Germany, you ate what you were given and were grateful for it. Questioning food allocations or expressing individual preferences was considered selfish, decadent, a sign of weak character unsuited to the collective struggle. In this American prison camp, even enemies were granted the dignity of personal choice. The dessert course offered 3 options: apple pie, chocolate cake, or lemon tart. Prisoners could select one, multiple, or none according to their own preference. No judgment, no rationing beyond reasonable portion sizes, no expectation that everyone should make the same choice. Underlieutenant Becker stood in the serving line, paralyzed by options that represented more than dessert. This was freedom expressed through choice. The ability to select pleasure for its own sake. To exercise individual will within a system that maintains social order without demanding uniformity. She chose both chocolate cake and apple pie, not from greed, but from desperate desire to experience everything that had been denied throughout her life. The chocolate cake, now familiar, represented her journey from shock to understanding. The apple pie, made with fruit preserved through technologies unknown in German food production, represented new discoveries yet to be made. As she ate, Alternating bites between the two desserts, Becker experienced something approaching revelation. This wasn't just food. It was freedom expressed through flavor, democracy demonstrated through dessert, human dignity recognized through the simple acknowledgement that individual preferences mattered. The contradictions with Nazi ideology were so profound that her old worldview had literally dissolved, replaced by understanding that human societies could create prosperity rather than merely distribute scarcity. That freedom produced abundance while authoritarian control produced deprivation. That treating humans as individuals with inherent dignity yielded better results than treating them as interchangeable components of a collective machine. By mid-May, prisoners were permitted to write censored letters to family members in occupied Germany. The letters would be reviewed by American authorities and could contain only personal matters, not military information or conditions of captivity. But even within those restrictions, the letters revealed the psychological transformation that chocolate cake had begun. Oberleutnant Zimmermann wrote to her surviving sister in Berlin. "Dearest Helga, I am well and healthy. Better than I have been in years. The Americans feed us 3 meals daily, all of quality that exceeds what we knew before the war. They have given me books to read, including German poets we had forgotten existed. They treat us with respect that I did not expect from enemies. Everything we were told about American society was incorrect. I cannot write details, but when I return home, I will have much to tell you about what I have learned. The world is not what we thought. Love always, Frida." The censors approved the letter with minimal redaction. It contained no military secrets, no criticism of American treatment, nothing that violated regulations. Yet it carried a message more subversive than any propaganda, the simple acknowledgement that Nazi teachings had been false, that American society functioned differently than described, that enemy treatment of prisoners exceeded German standards. Hundreds of such letters flowed from Camp Riverside to occupied Germany throughout May and June 1945. Each letter carried similar messages, careful, censored, but unmistakable. The women who had served the Reich with unwavering loyalty were telling families that everything had been lies. The evidence of their own experience contradicted years of indoctrination. The abundance, the kindness, the systematic efficiency they witnessed daily demolished ideological certainty. The first group of prisoners received repatriation orders in late June 1945. Germany was devastated, occupied by Allied forces, its government dissolved, its cities in ruins. The returning prisoners would face a homeland that bore little resemblance to the nation they had left. But they were returning transformed. These women who had arrived as true believers in Nazi ideology departed as witnesses to democratic prosperity. The transformation hadn't been imposed through coercion or indoctrination but had emerged naturally from exposure to a system that operated on principles they had been taught were impossible. On the morning of departure, the camp kitchen staff prepared a final meal that included, inevitably, chocolate cake. Underlieutenant Becker stood in the serving line one last time, accepting her slice with emotions too complex for words. This dessert that had shocked her into questioning everything now represented proof that free societies could create such surplus that enemies could taste luxuries their own families had never known. Staff Sergeant Martinez personally wished her farewell. "You learned to bake well. Those skills will be useful in rebuilding. Remember that sweetness doesn't make people weak. It reminds us why we're human." The train journey back to Germany reversed the revelation of the outbound trip. Instead of discovering American abundance, they witnessed European devastation. Bombed cities, destroyed infrastructure, populations living in ruins. The contrast between American prosperity and German destruction made the lessons learned at Camp Riverside even more devastating. In the years that followed, the women who had experienced Camp Riverside became witnesses to an alternative future. In occupied Germany, divided between East and West, their testimonies about American abundance proved more effective than any propaganda campaign. They had seen the enemy's homeland. They had experienced the enemy's treatment of prisoners. They had tasted the enemy's casual luxury. Oberleutnant Zimmermann, returning to devastated Dresden, found herself surrounded by neighbors eager for news of captivity. They expected stories of brutality and deprivation. Instead, she told the truth. the Americans fed us better than our own government ever did. They gave us chocolate cake while German children were starving. They preserved our culture better than we preserved it ourselves. They treated us with dignity that we never showed to prisoners in German camps. Everything we were told was lies. All of it. Such testimonies, repeated by hundreds of returning prisoners, proved more powerful than official denazification programs. These weren't Allied propagandists or political lecturers. These were German women who had served the Reich faithfully, who had believed in German superiority, who had experienced the truth firsthand and could no longer maintain the lies. The chocolate cake became legendary in their testimonies, not because it was extraordinary by American standards, but because it represented everything the Nazi system had failed to provide. Abundance rather than scarcity. Pleasure rather than sacrifice. Individual dignity rather than collective subordination. Freedom rather than control. Underlieutenant Becker opened a small bakery and rebuilt Nuremberg in 1948, using techniques learned from Sergeant Martinez. Her chocolate cake, made with ingredients that were still difficult to obtain in post-war Germany, became a symbol of the transformation that was possible. People came not just for dessert but for the story, the tale of how a simple cake had demolished an ideology, how sweetness had proven more powerful than propaganda, how abundance had conquered lies. Decades later, historians would analyze the psychological warfare aspects of Camp Riverside and similar facilities. The systematic use of abundance to challenge ideological indoctrination. The demonstration that democratic societies could outperform authoritarian systems not just in military might but in civilian prosperity. The proof that treating enemies humanely was both morally correct and strategically effective. But for the women who experienced it, the transformation remained intensely personal. They had tasted democracy, and it was delicious. They had experienced freedom, and it was nourishing. They had witnessed abundance, and it revealed the poverty of the ideology they had served. The chocolate cake that shocked them in May 1945 represented more than dessert. It was evidence that human societies could create prosperity rather than merely distribute scarcity. That free people could achieve more than controlled populations. That respecting individual dignity produced better results than demanding collective sacrifice. They had arrived at Camp Riverside as dedicated servants of a regime that promised strength through unity, purity through exclusion, greatness through sacrifice. They departed as witnesses to the power of diversity, the strength of freedom, and the prosperity that emerges when human dignity is recognized and human potential is unleashed. The sweetness lingered long after the flavors faded. The memory of that chocolate cake remained vivid decades later, not because it was extraordinary food, but because it represented an extraordinary truth. The evidence of their own senses had overwhelmed years of indoctrination. The simple pleasure of dessert had proven more powerful than propaganda. They had been taught that sacrifice was virtue, that suffering proved superiority, that scarcity was strength. Instead, they learned that abundance was possible, that pleasure was human, that prosperity was achievable. The lesson came not from political lectures or re-education programs, but from the simple act of tasting chocolate cake in an American prison camp while a global war still raged. In the end, 47 German women discovered that their greatest defeat hadn't come on battlefields but in mess halls. Their strongest enemy wasn't military might but casual abundance. Their most devastating loss wasn't territory but certainty. They had tasted the sweetness of truth, and it transformed them completely. The chocolate cake served in Camp Riverside that May afternoon proved more effective than any weapon in demonstrating that everything they had fought for was a lie. They returned to Germany carrying within their transformed bodies and reconstructed minds the sweetest evidence imaginable, that free societies could create such prosperity that even enemies could taste luxuries their own families had never known. They had served lies and tasted truth. The flavor would follow them forever, a reminder that human dignity, individual freedom, and democratic prosperity weren't weaknesses to be mocked but strengths to be celebrated. The chocolate cake had shown them the future, and they could never return to the past. Up next, you've got two more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.